First of all, let me point out that when I went there, I was a victim of the propaganda I am of Jewish heritage and swallowed the propaganda fully. And I went there only because, as president of the International College of Surgeons and the World Surgical Foundation, and 40 years of overseas mission work focusing on children, I knew that the population was 50% children, and I was going to help children irrespective of my political thoughts. And it was very clear the day that I got there that this was a genocide in the making. I was there when the World Central Kitchen vans got bombed. There was 250 trucks on the way in and thousands of trucks on the way out, waiting to get through an still open Rafah border, because they wouldn't provide to the truck drivers the deconfliction that was necessary to deliver the aid. You think about it, we saw 30 miles of trucks on the way out. They were 8 trucks wide. That's enough to encircle Gaza 3 times, bumper to bumper, 8 trucks just through the Rafah crossing. So the second week that we're there, the bombings kept getting closer to the hospital. The bombings were focused based on drone presence, which began around 3 o'clock, 3:30, getting ready to monitor where the collections of women and children would be, for iftar. And then when iftar would start, the bombings would start and become much more concentrated, which is why 90% of the patients who would come in mass casualties were children. 5 to a gurney, no less than 4 gurneys at a time. A third of the children would come in, put on the ambulances alive, but a third were dead when they got to us. A third would die in front of us, and a third would die within the next week or two in front of us. And it was nothing to see an empty bed the next day. It was clear that the hospitals were being targeted. I myself broke a finger and lost a tooth in a bombing that was right outside the hospital, and getting a detached retina fixed. That's been getting worse. And then, but it's not a woe is me thing, because although the hospital was targeted, and healthcare workers such as myself got hurt, there were specific targeting of healthcare workers. Many of the patients I took care of have horrible stories of being specifically targeted after being shot, taken to an Israeli prison, starved in that prison, blindfolded, handcuffed, with an open bullet wound inflicted while in the operating room, taking care of a patient, ordered to leave that patient. He refused doing his duty, closing a wound, and an orthopedic nurse shot in the knee and then taken prisoner. Stories like that are pervasive. I've operated on many people with lacerated nerves with the experimental tungsten bullets, and with mysterious entrance and exit wounds, very similar to the fledgets that were outlawed many years ago, that are still being used in a different form. The definitive population of women and children that were overwhelmingly the victim population screams genocide to us, in addition to the restriction of it. And most importantly, not only were 90% of our patients children, but when you look at the statistics scholarly collected by Dr. Feroz Sidwa in the New York Times article, when you break down the numbers, 83% of American-only doctors who were polled, 83% of those that treated children, because not everybody was there treated children, but 83% of those that treated children, laid hands on a child, saw a child that was shot by a sniper rifle in the chest or the head. And I myself saw 2 children that were targeted both in the chest and the head. Both came in simultaneously. And one of them had a male caregiver, and I neglected to ask because of the language barrier and the horrible commotion that was going on in an emergency room that's smaller than my kitchen. This male caregiver could be a father, could be an uncle. I asked him what happened through a translator, and he told me that he was walking his son, or the male child, and it felt him pull out of his hand He looked for him, looked down at the ground close to him, didn't see him. 10 meters away, he saw him. And then he saw his body get shot a second time. He looked to where the shot came from, identified an Israeli soldier. He ran to his kid and brought him in. But when he brought him in, he didn't have a chest. The small entrance wound is typical of a high velocity gun wound. And when I rolled him over, no organs between his shoulder blades existed. His spine, his lungs, his heart were all gone. My hand fell into his chest cavity. And yet he saw his potentially son or nephew, whatever. He saw him get shot in the head the second time. And this kid definitively had 2 high velocity bullet wounds. It's the first time I've held the brains of a child. So the genocide was definitive in my own sight. In terms of seeing a combatant, there were absolutely none. We saw one person who had a gunshot wound. It was not a high velocity wound. It was a pistol wound, acknowledged from the security guards at the hospital. This guy was a crook. He was caught stealing from people, and he was shot by a pistol. We actually, Dr. Sidwa and the group that I was with saved his life. But he was a criminal, a local crook, not a combatant. We never at any time saw anybody in military clothing. We never saw a military wound. We never saw anybody who suffered from a military wound. We never saw a rifle. We never saw anybody who could even remotely be accounted for as a military combatant on the premises of the hospital or outside of it. The hospital grounds at the European Gaza hospital were filled with patients, tens of thousands of displaced families looking at it as a protected environment, and thousands of patients. There were young male patients, but they all had wounds, and most of them were infections, superficial infections, none of which would even remotely be considered a battle wound. We just simply never saw it. The acting director of the hospital, the head director, was told to leave or his family home would be bombed, and so he left, I believe, to Egypt. The acting director, which I believe was a nurse, very brave human being, gave me a tour of the hospital. There were no tunnels underneath of it. There was a 3-foot tall HVAC tunnel that was filled with piping that no human can crawl under. There was no hidden spaces underneath or on above. And the hospital could have easily been taken over by the Israelis. There's 5 entrances. They could have put an American Bradley fighting vehicle in front of every one of them. It's a straight shot hallways with 4 stairwells. They could have put guards at the entrances, checked SIM cards of people coming into the emergency room to see if they had contacts. They could have kept that hospital operational instead of closing it a month after I left. But they chose not to, claiming it to be a bastion for combatants, of which there were absolutely none.